Welcome to Meta Horizon Inc. I'm your SailPoint instructor, Rabindra. Today, we are going to sail our IdentityIQ voyage. Let's begin talking about cybersecurity, identity and access management, and also talk more about SailPoint IdentityIQ. Like everyone else, I have been flooded with information about a recent security event. We know that the Colonial Pipeline Company network, you must have heard the news about it, right? Actually, the Colonial Pipeline Company network was hacked, due to which there was a scarcity of fuel or gasoline in the south. Actually, that attack happened due to a compromised old VPN password, and that VPN password didn't even use the multi-factor authentication. So this is where the cybersecurity practice or cybersecurity hygiene comes into highlight. Actually, cyber hygiene or cybersecurity practice is maintaining the basic health and security of software and hardware. Therefore, the cyber hygiene best practice includes creating a cyber hygiene policy, employing proper password management, minimizing administrative access to the network or IAM system, removing or uninstalling unwanted identities, using two-factor or multi-factor authentication and single sign-on. Therefore, with the implication of cyber hygiene, it improves security and maintenance. The enterprise data is better protected. Therefore, it is easier to identify unauthorized software and then identify unmanaged assets and run compliance audits. So we will also discuss more about identity IQ as well as the difference of its with identity and access management. So basically, we first have to talk about what is an identity. Therefore, identity is actually a digital representation of an account that is created or detected during the time of aggregation from authoritative system. So once identities are created in SailPoint IdentityIQ, the identities are used for tracking and managing individual access to various organizational resources, and by using identity, we can control users' access to IdentityIQ application itself. Therefore, identities are created in SailPoint IdentityIQ whenever a new account is detected and aggregated from an authoritative system. So we're going to describe more about how identities are created during our next class, where we're going to describe about application onboarding. But one thing you have to understand is that cyber attacks and constant threat to corporations' privacy arrangement and data have become a significant worry for association. Therefore, identity management as well as the authorized access essentially ensures that it is only the approved individual who can get to the information on the cloud and at the same time can appropriately deal with the equivalent. Therefore, the main objective of identity and access management system is to provide one digital identity per employee or individual, and to provide right access to the available right enterprise access to the right number of users in the right time. So this makes the user's system to get the permission to access the resources on time. So once the digital identity per individual has been built, it should be maintained, modified, and monitored throughout the user's access lifecycle. So the main purpose of identity and access management systems are basically designed to manage user access across an enterprise and to confirm compliances related to the corporate policies and government regulations. So the agendas we're gonna describe today are more related to identity and access management. Is introduction to SailPoint IdentityIQ, the basic difference between IdentityIQ and SailPoint, and what are the business objectives and achievements that we're gonna have depending upon the IIQ implement. So we're also gonna describe about the architectures of SailPoint IdentityIQ and the modules of IdentityIQ. Besides that, we also gonna describe about the deployment architectures, the multi-configuration environment setup of SailPoint IdentityIQ, and ultimately describe about the duties of SailPoint Developer. So let's jump on to the next slide. So I've already discussed about identity and access management systems. So as I discussed earlier, the main purpose of IAM systems are to manage user access across an enterprise and to confirm compliances related to corporate policies and government regulations. So if I have to discuss more about the IAM architecture, so the IAM architectures are composed of different components depending upon the user lifecycle and management. Here we have to deal with the password management. We also have to deal with the compliance controls. For the added security, we have to implement single sign-on and multi-factor authentication. There also comes a time where we have to deal with role management, access requests, data governance, and identity analytics. Let's move on to next slide, where we will be describing more about SailPoint IdentityIQ. So SailPoint IdentityIQ is an identity and role and access management tool. So it was developed by SailPoint, which is an Austin-based tech company. So besides SailPoint IdentityIQ, there are other biggest market competitors in the field of identity and access management, which are IBM Tivoli Management, Oracle Identity Management, Omada, and Micro Focus. So the unique feature of SailPoint IdentityIQ is that it's a role management tool in addition to identity and access management. Therefore, IdentityIQ integrates the features of provisioning and compliance to a single appropriate solution. So this solution will provide all the required features that an enterprise requires in order to maintain the identity and access management requirement solution. So let's move on to next slide. In this slide, I have just given the differences between identity and access management and IIQ. As I told earlier, SailPoint IdentityIQ is also an identity and access management tool, but the unique feature it has is that it is based on roles, so it is also used for role management in an organization. So besides that, IdentityIQ can be integrated to different third-party applications, different kind of business applications by using our integration module, where we will describe about this module in next slide. And also we can have artificial intelligence implemented, from where we can perform different kind of AI benefits. So these benefits will be described in the coming classes. So let's quickly describe about why SailPoint IIQ, why not other tools, and what are the benefits of it to an organization. So whenever SailPoint IdentityIQ is implemented in an organization or enterprise, the main thing is that the access control can be scaled up. So if the company's identities are increasing, then in that case we can just boost up or scale the IdentityIQ architecture horizontally or vertical depending upon the requirement. Besides that, SailPoint IdentityIQ provides three kind of provisioning. So provisioning is basically to grant access or to revoke accesses. So we can implement automated provisioning, manual provisioning, and workflow based provisioning. And during the time of certification campaign, we can also stage the certification campaign, so that errors can be pre-detected once the certification goes live. And besides that, SailPoint IdentityIQ also implements the concept of partitioning. So the partitioning also helps us to better up the performance and consistent scalability. And it also reduces the time across the access request and approval. And besides that, IdentityIQ also uses IdentityIQ role modeling. So based on these, we can implement role-based access control, we can perform role mining, and we can also describe more about the IdentityIQ object modeling. So once all these benefits are achieved, the next benefit is that SailPoint IdentityIQ acts as centralized governance across the data center and cloud environment. So all the accesses that a user requests are done through SailPoint IdentityIQ. Since SailPoint IdentityIQ is integrated with different kind of cloud applications, business applications, and with the use of REST APIs. With the use of REST APIs, we can deal with different kind of applications. So the more on applications and application onboarding will be described in our session based on application onboarding in SailPoint. So this is the basic architecture of SailPoint. So the business need in an enterprise could be like setting up access authentication, some kind of access request, automated provisioning, password management, and policy management. So in order to implement these business need, SailPoint has come up with the business models like policy model, role model, workflow and engine, identity warehouse, reporting, and risk model. So by the use of these models, the business data SailPoint can utilize are the users, applications, and data. Therefore, application act as a source of employees information, and based on these employee informations, SailPoint will create identities on SailPoint side. So an identity in SailPoint is actually the digital representation of user records in the enterprise applications. So besides that, SailPoint also provides an integration framework called integration configuration. So with the help of integration configuration, we can implement connectors, APIs, and plugins to interact with business applications and IT infrastructures such as third-party ticketing systems, on-premise applications, as well as cloud apps. More to be discussed in the next slide. Let's move on to next slide. So this slide basically describes about the business achievement that we're gonna get using SailPoint IdentityIQ. So the basic advantages the business will get is that it increases the security and regulatory compliance, as well as it also provides the business services, such as it provides control to the business, it helps in the password management and access request chains, and as well as it also reduces the IT support call and volume, and increases the amount of administration automation such that it increases the IT efficiency in an enterprise. So this is the high level IIQ architecture. So in this blue diagram, you can see the different modules of SailPoint: compliance, governance, lifecycle manager, and user provisioning. And it also shows different kind of connectors and modules. So IdentityIQ basically gets the data of the users from source applications, which we also call source of truth. So once the source system or HR system is integrated with IdentityIQ, SailPoint starts building or creating the digital representation of user records corresponding to the HR system, and these data are called identities in SailPoint IdentityIQ. And SailPoint IdentityIQ deals with the identity for its management, modifications throughout its life cycle. And by using integration config, SailPoint IdentityIQ's functionality can be increased by integrating it to the ticketing and change management system, mobile device management systems, and with the use of connectors, it can interact with different kinds of user repositories, which can be Active Directory, JDBC, SAP, or kind of mainframe or legacy systems such as Top Secret, RACF. Let's move on to next slide. So this slide basically describes more about the compliance manager module, lifecycle manager module, governance platform, user provisioning. So in simple term, compliance manager deals with auditing, reporting, managing activities, access authentication, and policy enforcement, so as to prioritize the most critical compliance activities that reduces the risk. The other one is lifecycle manager. So lifecycle manager deals with user provisioning, with the implementation of different kinds of LCM events such as new hire, employee transfer, moving, or terminations throughout the integration of authoritative sources. And governance platform is actually a definition to represent the centralization or federation of identity data. So that means SailPoint IdentityIQ will be integrated with different kind of authoritative as well as non-authoritative system, so that all the employees' informations are sent to the IdentityIQ, and based on these, SailPoint IdentityIQ starts creating identities, and all these identities can be found in the warehouse of SailPoint IdentityIQ. Besides that, SailPoint also implements user provisioning by the implementation of automated provisioning, workflow provisioning, and manual provisioning. So the basic purpose of user provisioning is to establish the bridge between compliance and user lifecycle processes. So I will be discussing. So these are the installation components and supported platforms. So in order to deploy or implement SailPoint IdentityIQ, we can have application servers, we need databases, Java platform, browsers, mobile support. So it all depends upon what kind of choice you want and you are most comfortable maintaining with. So these are the deployment of SailPoint IIQ in enterprise. So basically, SailPoint IdentityIQ deals with the multi-configuration environment. With that, I mean SailPoint instances can be deployed in a development environment or integration environment. We can also have a QA environment, test environment, or staging, and we can also have production environment. Next, we discussed more about this in the next slide. So in this slide, you can see that different developers work on their sandbox. So each of the developer works on the requirement to be implemented into IdentityIQ. So once all the developers perform the local test, the codes are pushed into the version control system, and based on this version control system, it goes through a build process. And for the build process, SailPoint IdentityIQ or the SailPoint Inc. has provided a services standard build process which we will be implementing, and based on these deployment WAR files are generated, and these WAR files are actually deployed in the environments the organization has established. So the multi-configuration environment has a choice to establish development environment, staging environment, QA environment, U environment, and production environment. So we'll be discussing more about this during the period of SSP interaction. The more we have to discuss about is the IAQ deployment architecture type. So the simplest model is the one that we locally set up whenever we are trying to discuss more about or deal more about SailPoint IdentityIQ. The processing and segregation, storage segregation is the other one. Application server availability, redundancy is called the multi-host deployment. Let's move on. Let's quickly describe about these architecture types. So in simplest model, the IdentityIQ is deployed into an application server and is stable created in a database server. Therefore, the application server and database server are running into a single host. But if we run separately the IdentityIQ in application server in host 1 and the IdentityIQ tables in the database server on host 2, then this kind of architecture is known as processing and storage segregation. The other advanced deployment architecture type is called application server availability, redundancy. So in this case, we will designate different hosts for the application server. So the application servers of IdentityIQ can act as a UI host or the batch host, and the UI host and batch host has its own responsibilities to be performed, and all these hosts can interact with a single database server that is deployed into a next host machine. So this slide describes about the distinction between the UI and batch host. So the batch host handles the workflows, the task and report generation, certification generation, and UI actually holds the access request, performing certification and dynamic analytics. So in an enterprise, we actually implement this kind of architecture. So this architecture is called single facility architecture, or in simple term, it is also called standard two-tier enterprise web application architecture. So in this architecture, you can see that in the data center, there are UI servers and task servers as well as database servers related to IdentityIQ, and this data center is interacting with the users through firewall. But if we want to have this single facility architecture with disaster recovery, then there gonna be some certain tweak in the architecture. So this is the architecture which contains two IAQ host data center facility implementation in case of disaster. So the single facility two-tier enterprise architectures comes up with a redundant standby or secondary data center. So this kind of redundant disaster recovery enterprise network architecture of SailPoint is implemented so that during the outage of the primary database data center, the secondary data center can handle the normal operation of IAM system. So the last slide describes about the SailPoint developers. So there are different activities or responsibilities of SailPoint developers. So SailPoint developer actually works with different cross-functional teams for IdentityIQ upgrades and patching, like the QA team, BA team, middleware team of IT infrastructure. Besides that, SailPoint developer actively participates in service establishment, certification campaign, application onboarding, and application governance of identity governance and access management. SailPoint developers have to follow the software development lifecycle, agile principles, and values for code build and deployments. SailPoint developer must also understand the requirement of clients and application owner, because once the design of the requirement goes into effect, the changes in the meanwhile might cause alarm and soldier. And SailPoint developers are also actively involved in the development of role-based access control. So SailPoint developers will be following the IdentityIQ role modeling, based on which there are different kinds of role modeling approaches we'll be describing later. And the other important features SailPoint developers work are in the custom workflow development, rules development, lifecycle events development, creation of provisioning plan, and compliances. Besides that, SailPoint developers are also required to be expertise on the custom connector development, custom web service creation, implementation of SIM, multi-factor authentication, single sign-on. But the tools and concept that is required for SailPoint development includes the expertise in Eclipse and IntelliJ IDE, the Git, the Jira, which is the project management tool. He should also be able to work with IIQ console, Docker, MySQL, Linux, core Java. The SailPoint developers should be able to understand the object-oriented programming, the concept of IdentityIQ object model, and documentation. So most importantly, what I would say is that SailPoint developers need to identify the learning goals, create a learning habit, and then identify the on-the-job experience, which will effectively facilitate the SailPoint developers learning. So I hope that you have received the benefits of having this course. So besides that, what I'm gonna focus more on is that SailPoint developers should be able to understand these technologies. So with relation to the IdentityIQ object model, the SailPoint developers should be able to configure applications, identity attributes, rules, and different other tools in SailPoint IdentityIQ. Besides that, the SailPoint developers must also be able to have some web application object or knowledges, which is basically the HTML, CSS, XML images. And besides that, SailPoint developers should be able to customize tags, connectors, integrations, should be able to interact with the workflows, libraries, and plugin development. So I hope that you just got what SailPoint IdentityIQ is, what IdentityIQ and access management system is, and what are the responsibilities that the SailPoint developer has to perform. So I would just say that this is the beginning phase of becoming a SailPoint developer. So I hope that you got benefits and ideas about how to become a SailPoint developer, and what will your responsibilities be when you are on this job. So I would just request you all to follow up for my next classes. In order to follow up for my next classes, I would just request you all to subscribe, like, and share this YouTube channel of Meta Horizon Inc. This is all for now. This is all for today. Hope to meet you in the next class. Thank you guys. Thank you all. Just post your questions on the comments. I would be happy to answer your questions. Thank you. Have a good day.